So it has been a couple weeks since we've been on campus, at least. But we were here online for the last couple weeks, but it's one of those things where 2 weeks ago I missed mass on campus because I had my mom's wake and her funeral the next day, and then the following week I was supposed to be on campus, but I had a plane that did not take off when it was supposed to take off, and so I did not land when I was supposed to land, so I did not have masses. So basically, I say that all just to kind of apologize. We're going to do a little recap, because for some people who will be joining us on Sunday, they haven't been with us for the last couple weeks, and so here's the recap. Well, we started this series in Lent called Prototype, and it's based off of the book, based off the Bible, basically based off the book, The Imitation of Christ. So basically, I think The Imitation of Christ has been known as the second best-selling book after after the Bible, and right ahead of Harry Potter. And the whole idea of the imitation of Christ is the whole goal of the Christian life, which is the whole goal of Lent. We recognize that the goal of Lent, the goal of the Christian life, is not just to become a slightly better person, it's not to develop good habits or get rid of bad habits, it's not to lose some weight. The whole goal of the Christian life, the whole purpose of Lent is to become like Jesus. The whole purpose of Lent is to become like a rabbi. So Jesus is the prototype in all this. And so what did we talk about? The very first week, we talked about these schools, like back in the day, if you were a Jewish person, a kid in the time of Jesus, the first school you went to at 6 years old was called Bet Sefer. And Bet Sefer was 6 years old to 10 years old. You memorized the first 5 books of Moses, right? Exodus, Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You memorized those first 5 books. And if you're done, the rabbi said, okay, now go learn the trade of your father. But if you're the best of the best, you got moved on to the second school that was called Bet Talmud. And you learned the entire rest of the Bible. When I say learned the rest of the Bible, I mean you memorized the rest of the Bible. You knew all of the words. That's Bet Talmud until you're 15. Now at 15, that was good enough for you, your rabbi would say, now go learn your father's trade. But those who are like the best of the best of the best would go look for a rabbi. Up to that point, 15 years old, you're simply a student. But at this point, you're taking the next step, and you're looking for a rabbi because you want to become a disciple. Now, why is this important? It's important because at 15 years old, you have the entire Bible memorized. Like all of the words you know, all the teachings you know, but you don't know how to live them. Like you don't know how to understand. Like how do these words that God has spoken to us, through Moses, through the other prophets, how are those words supposed to be lived out? And so you'd find a rabbi, and you'd watch how they lived. You'd see how they lived them out. You'd see how they approached people. You'd see how they approached God. You'd see how they approached temptations. That's what we've been doing, right? We've been looking at how did Jesus, as a rabbi, how did Jesus approach temptation? Then the second week was, how does Jesus pray? How does he approach his Father? The week after that was, what's Jesus' vision for the world? In fact, that idea of Jesus having a particular vision for the world comes from when Jesus tells his disciples, he says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. So we know what a yoke is, right? A yoke is a farming implement that usually was a dual yoke, right? You'd have 2 ox or 2 donkeys, whatever it was, and this yoke would go around the neck and shoulders of this farming animal. Now, there were 2 of them. So as Jesus is saying, take my yoke upon you, he's not saying, I'm taking the yoke off, you guys do it now, you do all the work, I don't want to do anything. He's saying, I want to be side by side with you. Imagine what that would look like. If your head was through the yoke of Jesus, that would mean that you are seeing the world the way Jesus sees the world. And that's what it is in so many ways, to have Jesus as a rabbi. This is the third school called Bet Midrash. If your rabbi took you, he called you, you're in Bet Midrash. That's what Lent is. Lent is Bet Midrash, where we follow our rabbi so closely that we begin to live like him, we begin to look like him, and we have this vision. So how does Jesus, as I said, how does Jesus approach temptation? Prayer. How does he see other people that people dismiss? This week, we're going to look at how does Jesus look at suffering in the world? And not comprehensively, but even in a very specific way, because we have to narrow it down. I don't know if you caught this, but that was a really long gospel reading. It was the entire the entire 9th chapter of John's gospel. What I want to focus on is the first 3 verses of the entire chapter. The first 3 verses are phenomenal, are fascinating. It says they're walking by, they see this man born blind, and the disciples ask Jesus this question. The question is, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? No, this is a really good question to ask. And it makes sense. It makes complete sense, because here are the disciples. They know the Bible. There's 3 kind of major wisdom books. There's a bunch of wisdom books, but the 3 kind of big ones are the book of Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, and the book of Job. And every one of those books offers kind of a vision for life. And so Proverbs is how to live a good life. Well, really simply, do good and get good. Like if you do the right things, you're going to get good things. Do bad and get bad. It's kind of this really, really balanced way of looking at the world. You want good, do good. You want bad, you do bad. Ecclesiastes, that's the first wisdom book. That's one way of looking at the world. So look at the guy who's born blind. Did someone do bad to get him some bad stuff? But Ecclesiastes says, okay, listen, I've seen the world too. I've seen that the world is not fair. I've seen good people lose everything. And I've seen people do bad and get everything. And so which one is it here? I think the most incredible thing is that both of them are right. Both Proverbs, do good and get good, do bad and get bad, and Ecclesiastes, sometimes you can do good and lose everything, and sometimes you can do the wrong thing and get everything. They're both right. Because we know that's the case, right? In our lives, sometimes you make good choices and things go well. And sometimes you can do everything right and everything still falls apart. They're both true. So the disciples are looking at this man born blind, and they want to know, what does the rabbi think? How does the rabbi, they know all the words, remember, they know all the words of the Bible, but they want to know, okay, Jesus, how do you see it? If we have your yoke on our shoulders, how do you see this suffering in the world? But I think it's interesting because the disciples don't ask the question just, why is this the case that this man is born blind? They ask a different question. They ask, who sinned? In other words, they ask the question, whose fault is it? Like, who's to blame? And this is so important. And we're going to stay here for today because I think, how often is that us? How often do we see suffering? Do we see pain? Do we see evil in the world and say, okay, who's to blame? Like, whose fault is it? When we go through pain ourselves, we say, who's to, and that makes sense. I mean, it makes sense. If you think that, someone could be blind because of someone else's fault, the disciples saying, okay, who did this? Because I want to avoid that in my life. That would make sense. But also we ask that question, like, whose fault is it? Who's to blame? Because we all know that choices have consequences. And I think we need to remember this, right? We need to remember that there are consequences to our choices and there are consequences to other people's choices and that we have to bear. I mean, think about, I've been thinking about this a lot because here's this man born blind. Was it his fault or his parents' fault? You say neither. That's Jesus' answer, is neither, but sometimes it is another person's fault. We all have heard of fetal alcohol syndrome. Here is a child born with some kind of struggle that they will have to endure for their entire life. Whose fault is that? Well, it's their mom's fault. Because while they were pregnant with this child, they drank alcohol. So in that case, you would actually say, again, choices have consequences. And someone else's choices have dramatic consequences on another person's life. We know that this is true. We also know that sometimes our choices have consequences. There was a kid, the year after I graduated high school, he graduated. This is how it works. He was a year behind me. And graduation weekend, I remember he just went out with some friends. He was like, I liked this kid a lot. He was so fun. He was really fun-loving. He just loved life. Graduation weekend, he ran off a dock and dove into water, not knowing that it was only a foot deep. And in an instant, his life changed. He became completely paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of his life, till the end of his life. Because our choices have consequences. Sometimes we do things that we didn't want that to happen. I mean, we look at sometimes our own hearts and we think like, you meet a person who's really defensive, a person who's just quick to snap. And you realize, well, why is that? And you say, well, actually, that's someone who might have been like teased mercilessly when they were a kid, and now they're just kind of defensive. Now they're just kind of those people who just always ready to attack. Because choices have consequences, right? Other people's choices have consequences in our lives. Or someone who in every relationship, they find themselves really unable or incapable of trust. Why? Because I've been betrayed before, right? I've been cheated on before. We know that these consequences, these wounds, these pains, they're real. And sometimes we can all trace our wounds to something someone else has done. In fact, I was listening to a woman not too long ago, and she said, all the garbage in my life, all the baggage that I've brought to my life, to my relationships, to my marriage, she says, I can trace it back to the abuse that I experienced as a little girl at the hands of my own father. She said, that's real. all that brokenness, that there's a reason why I have this baggage. There's a reason why I have these wounds. But even she said, but there's a problem when my reason becomes my excuse. So someone who would say like, well, I'm critical because my mom was a really harsh judge when I was growing up. Okay, but that sounds like an excuse now. Or I have a really hot temper because my dad had a short fuse when I was growing up. Okay, that could be a reason, but we don't want to let that reason become an excuse, because in those cases, when I ask the question, well, whose fault is it? The number one answer is, not mine. And I guess that makes sense, of course. It makes sense to ask the question. It makes sense to ask the question, whose fault? Because when we're in pain, we want to find the source of our pain. Like when we're in pain, we want to find the source of our suffering. I don't know if you've ever had this experience where I think you wake up one day and you're like, your knee hurts for some reason, or say your back hurts for some random reason. It's like, why? Wait, what the heck? What happened? Like, and then you just ask the question, like, what did I do? And then if it's not, I remember this kind of sense of like, I don't know why my knee hurts. Oh, that's right. I helped Jack move yesterday. It's Jack's fault because he asked me to move. Like, my knee hurts because of him. Or this happened a ton, right, in the last couple of years where you get COVID. Like, wait, who did you get COVID from? Like, whose fault is this? And the problem is, of course, we can end up spending all of this time and all this energy trying to find the source of our suffering. And the question is, for what? Like, if I keep asking the question, like, whose fault is it? Who's to blame? Someone says, well, why do you need to know that? The answer is, well, because then I could what? Why? Why do I need to track down the source of my suffering? Why do I need to track down the origin of these wounds? Why do I need to find out whose fault is it? Because every one of us will find ourselves with wounds that we did not self-inflict and in situations that we did not create. What good is it to ask whose fault it is? Because you and I, we may not be responsible for the cards that we've been dealt in life, but we are responsible for how we play those cards. That I may not ever know who's to blame. I may not ever know whose fault it is, or why I'm going through what I'm going through. You may never know why it is you're going through what you're going through. But the most important question is not, why am I going through this, but what am I going to do with it? The most important question is not whose fault it is, but what am I going to do with this? Back in 1984, a man named Dr. David Rabin, he was 45 years old. He was 45 years old in 1979. He was a professor of medicine at Vanderbilt University. He taught medicine. He worked with patients. At 45 years old, he discovered he had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And as a medical doctor, he knew exactly what would happen. He knew that his lower extremities would become stiff, they become weak, and they become useless. And that paralysis essentially would spread through his upper extremities, would affect his speech and steal his ability to even speak with his family, speak with his patients, speak with his students. And unfortunately, another doctor had invented this machine, this computer, that would allow someone to be able to communicate as long as they had one functioning muscle group. Dr. David Rabin, as his body slowly became paralyzed, the one functioning muscle group he retained was his eyebrow, one eyebrow. But with that eyebrow for the next 4 years, beginning in 1980, he was able to continue to communicate with his family. He was able to continue to tell jokes with them. He was able to continue to tell them he loved them. He was able to tutor medical students with one eyebrow. He still taught medicine. In fact, he wrote a landmark book on endocrinology, and he did it all with one eyebrow. And he didn't spend his time, didn't waste his time asking, like, whose fault is this, or who's to blame about this? He did ask, what can I do with this? And this is what Jesus does too in the third verse of chapter 9. When they ask him, Rabbi, whose fault is this? Who is to blame? His parents or him? Jesus says, neither. It is so you might know the works of God. This is here so that God can be revealed. Basically, Jesus, our rabbi, right, our prototype, is saying it's no one's fault, no one's to blame, but there's something more going on here. And the question you don't have to ask is, where did this come from, or why is this here? But the question is, what can God do with this? Not whose fault is it, but who is going to be glorified in this. And there's this level of trust that is absolutely essential in this moment, right? Because Jesus doesn't tell why this happened, but he does say, here's what can happen. And that's what happens with the rest of the chapter, right? With the rest of the chapter, here is this man who is born blind, who now can see, and everyone's gathered around him saying, like, how in the world, what in the world is happening? But in this, Jesus is being glorified. God is being glorified, even if we never get a reason why this happened, who is to blame, or whose fault it is. And this is the last thing. The 3 wisdom books, right, that I mentioned. Proverbs, you do good, you get good. You do bad, you get bad. Ecclesiastes, life is not fair. Sometimes you can do